Committee. This is the next session of our IJIS virtual summits, today focused on cybersecurity. It's brought to you with the help and input from the Joint Technology Committee of CASCA and NACM and the IJIS Security Task Force. And I want to hand this over to our moderator this morning, Kevin Bowling. Kevin?
Thank you, Joe, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking some time out of your busy days to join us for this important virtual summit. So welcome. This is Cybersecurity in Courts, Ask the Experts. And as you know, the event is part of the IJIS Exchange Virtual Summit Series. And we're really happy to have such a diverse audience for our discussion today. We've got a number of court professionals, CIOs, industry representatives, and others joining us. In essence, we hope for an engaging dialogue on the cyber vulnerabilities within our court communities and the best practices to help mitigate these risks. As Joe mentioned, my name is Kevin Bowling. I serve as a co-chair of the Joint Technology Committee, or JTC, and as a member of the IJIS Courts Advisory Committee, and it's my honor to assist today as moderator. Following a four-part JTC webinar series on various cybersecurity issues faced by our nation's judicial branch, the IJIS Courts Advisory Committee determined there was a need to provide each of you with this opportunity to engage with experts in an extended Q&A forum. And we encourage you to fully engage in this informal and open discussion. I plan to take just a few minutes to review the topics and key issues that were raised by the JTC cyber webinars, and then you'll hear briefly from our panel of experts. Once they introduce themselves to you, we will begin the moderated discussion and encourage you to join the conversation directly or share your questions and comments in the chat feed. The JTC Cyber Monday webinar series began back in February with a lively conversation entitled Tales from the Cyber Front Lines, Lessons from Lived Experiences. The focus was on recent action taken by the Conference of Chief Justices and the Conference of State Court Administrators to increase cybersecurity practices in state courts. Lessons learned from the recent ransomware attacks on the Texas and Alaska court systems also featured prominently in these presentations. The series continued March 28th with Cybersecurity Basics for Courts. This webinar reviewed a 2021 JTC resource bulletin by the same name, discussing issues like incident prevention, cybersecurity governance, policy and planning, as well as the assembly of an incident response team. Additional resources from the Center for Internet Security were provided as an overview of the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or MSISAC. On April 25th, the series shifted to the issue of cyber insurance. Should you pay the ransom? Judicial branch CIOs from 2 states, which had reached different conclusions on the value of cyber insurance, together with an insurance expert and the VP of Risk Management for IJIS member Thomson Reuters, provided significant insights into the relative value of cyber insurance. And then the series concluded on May 23rd with a discussion of what's in your cyber COOP, or your continuity of operations plan. Perspectives from a CIO, a state court administrator, and a trial court administrator informed these important presentations, as well as suggestions from model continuity plans. So each of these webinars were recorded, and links to the presentations and related materials will be made available to each of you. As you can tell, the courts community is concerned about cybersecurity and has at least initiated some conversation about actual system breaches, remediation, restoration, and perhaps more importantly, how to harden existing systems to help prevent extensive damage that can be caused by cyber attacks. And not the cyber attacks that might happen, more likely the ones that are already taking place that we may not even know about. So today, we look for expertise and guidance from the IGIS community and to strengthen partnerships that will help ensure our ongoing ability to serve the public within the justice sector. So with that as a little lead in, our panel of experts today that are going to help with this endeavor include Jim Emerson, Vice President of the National White Collar Crime Center, Barbara Holmes, who's a Principal Court Management Consultant with the National Center for State Courts, and Dean Accavelli, a Director for Secure Enterprise with Microsoft State and Local Government. So at this point, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Jim Emerson to kick off our panel of experts. And I encourage you again to begin sharing any questions or comments you may have in the chat box, and we will engage you very shortly. And with that, Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate your warm welcome. I am, as Kevin mentioned, in the leadership queue at NW3C. I also chair the Computer Crime and Digital Evidence Committee for IACP and have for 11 years. I'm really glad to be here. I'm going to try to keep this brief so that we can focus on interaction with you all today as we kind of take on a number of very complex topics. Geopolitical drivers should be no surprise to this audience, and they've obviously compounded, if not focused and even broadened the threat landscape that we are now facing over the last 6 to 9 months. The affiliations among threat organizations, as well as reorganization of talent in the criminal sense within these organizations, have brought new skill sets or realigned old tools in new ways as we seek to protect ourselves. And that needs to be understood. We've seen threat graduate from cryptographic and leaked data or access limiting confidentiality concerns in the way of attacks to outright data destruction and concern regarding our data integrity on a number of levels as it relates to the criminal justice system. Critical infrastructure is seeing threat attention increase, both directly and, as importantly, indirectly through partners. Since this audience is a critical infrastructure sector part of it, this is certainly worth noting. We've arrived at an era where acceptable risk, in my humble opinion, that may have been tolerable historically is now negligible. Risk management efficacy as organizations go in the stack of all the things they have to do, the workflow complexities of the day-to-day efforts of these organizations need to be greater and elevated in terms of both being more comprehensive for that coverage and the speed with which it is nimbly able to address changes that confront us day in and day out. Most importantly, risk management at this point in history needs to be driven by intolerable outcomes. Thinking backward from not just those issues that keep us awake at night, but those issues which will keep us awake for weeks, needs to be the hallmark of risk management program efficacy and execution. Checklists alone are obviously insufficient. And that brings me finally to my last point before turning this over to Barbara, and that is risk transference as a kind of a footnote for what Kevin said is an area that has changed and continues to change. Underwriting of cyber risk has become very complicated. Actuarial data that historically was thought adequate may not be as adequate in this day and age. And from an insured perspective, it needs to be approached very deliberately and with the information that comes from adequate risk management, security test and evaluation, and that which feeds into your warranty with that underwriter. In this day and age, risk transference cannot be trivialized and just casually leaned on. It's way too complex a topic. So Barbara, having said all that and bringing those issues to the table, over to you.
Okay. Well, as Kevin said, I'm Barbara Holmes with the National Center for State Courts. I was formerly the Assistant Director of IT for the Pennsylvania AOPC. I also have served as interim IT CIO for First Judicial District, Philadelphia, PA, and I know some of those folks are on the call today. Also, I've served as CIO in West Virginia and as Director of Infrastructure for Vermont. Amongst all those things, I've actually been involved in remediation of several cybersecurity issues and incidents, as well as helping courts assess their risk and also discuss their data privacy issues, which often are very important because of the prevalence of private secure information such as social security numbers and other demographics, as well as financial information in some courts. So the courts have been hit hard by ransomware attacks in particular and continue to be hit every day. There's been, incidents in Ohio. Many little municipal courts in Ohio have been hit by ransomware issues. Kansas City, and First Judicial District in Philadelphia was hit with a very big ransomware attack. And involved in many of these attacks is the issue that they're on an executive branch network and are essentially assuming that they can trust the executive branch to maintain cybersecurity for the courts. And often in these attacks, the executive branch immediately cuts the courts off from any network access. So the courts need to be very concerned about the prevalence of such attacks, even if they're depending upon the resources of another provider. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dean for his comments.
Good morning. Well, it's morning where I am in Seattle. So my name is Dean Yacovelli. I have been working for Microsoft with state and local customers exclusively for 17 years now, in and out of cybersecurity. And so, you can't have a security presentation without like a problem statement or talk about the threat landscape, which has been alluded to already. So, we scare because we care, right? And the reality is that where I've landed in terms of kicking off this conversation with customers, it comes down to a threat landscape and a resourcing landscape, right? On the threat landscape, I'm not going to bore you with all the statistics. State and local governments are being hit really hard, disproportionately hard if you look at the data compared to other industries. And there's a very simple reason for that. It's resourcing. Right. So, for example, there was a recent NASCIO report, the Association of State CIOs, that compared commercial to federal to state and local government spend as a percentage of IT on cybersecurity. It was 28 in commercial, 16 in federal, and 2% in states. So I feel like that you don't have to do a whole lot of math to figure out if you're a lazy/busy hacker, who are you going to go after? And so the resourcing problem, I always express it mostly in terms of people, because let's get to the root of why cyber is so much more frustrating than other IT problems. It's because it's an asymmetrical challenge, like terrorism, in the sense that the resources required to defend are far, far orders of magnitude greater than those required to attack. And so that creates an incredible amount of friction and risk for state and local governments who were already challenged from a resourcing perspective before that. So really, if you can't throw bodies at the problem, either because you can't afford that talent in a cyber secure job industry where there are 3 million, pick your report, there's maybe 3 million unfilled cybersecurity jobs, including on my team, by the way. So governments are competing with me personally for cybersecurity talent. And so if you can't get those people or can't fund those people, something else has to change in how we approach the cybersecurity problem if we have any right to expect an improvement in our outcomes, which are not great. by the way. And so where I've landed is the only end game for state and local governments specifically, because of this resourcing challenge, is to get automating. We have to automate the boring. We have to automate the essential, because the attackers are automating. They're using AI and machine learning to automate their attacks. And if this is the arms race that I remember it as, if you're not automating as well, it's not much of a race anymore. So I'll leave it on that sour note.
Dean, thanks for the sour note and for, just raising a real interesting, competition, as you put it, between private sector and government sector, the public sector. Paul raises an interesting question from Nevada, saying that he's heard a lot about public and private partnerships, and it seems like cybersecurity could be an ideal area for this kind of partnership, but he doesn't see a lot of great examples. Do you or Barb or Jim have any suggestions on where we might be able to go and whether a partnership between private sector and public sector could help us do better in this regard?
I can give one example, at least for Microsoft, and it even comes with a tour now that we're coming out of COVID. There's actually a tour of what Microsoft calls the Digital Crimes Unit. And that is, to me, the best example of a partnership where Microsoft partners with the FBI, with Interpol, with all international law enforcement, as well as taking a judicial approach, for example, to taking down botnets globally. And there's some, I can provide a link to the Digital Crimes Unit site if anybody's interested in that. But that's the example that comes to mind for me. Like, we've taken down botnets, which are basically slaved computers, like sometimes in the millions of devices, and they are basically rented out by the hackers to whoever wants to, to whoever wants to pay to do denial of service attacks, take down websites, etc., to send spam, etc., to mine Bitcoin, and basically we take these down, actually often using weird, obscure laws in different countries, to sometimes like farming laws, if you can believe it. There's some great case studies. Anyway, that's the example that comes to mind for me that's been working and providing a global good using those partnerships.
All right. Well, Dean, that sounds really interesting. And I'm sure we've got some participants today that might be interested in that link if you want to drop it in the chat. Barb or Jim, do you have any thoughts from your experiences on public-private partnerships and where we might be able to leverage those to improve our situation?
Well, the National Center is partnering with some private companies to provide risk assessments at reasonable cost to courts, because that really is a prohibitor of those relationships, and also to facilitate discussions with courts. And I think that in general, we have a problem with making courts important to the greater community, in that in a lot of the incidents that I've seen, people don't realize how important it is to have courts actively working, and things like, people being arraigned, backing up, and things like that, as well as the financial issues that courts can cause in terms of not being available to, basically so that people can buy houses and get deeds and things like that. So I think there is kind of a problem with how our community views courts and their importance in the overall infrastructure.
I think that's a great point, Barb, and I think for some of our listeners might be aware of it, but as you alluded to, my understanding is that the National Center has begun to put together a whole litany of cybersecurity resources for trial courts. And that's something that folks might want to look at the National Center website for to see what's available and what might be rolling out in the coming months. Jim, any thoughts from your perspective on this public-private partnership?
Kevin, there are actually a number of really good illustrations of how public-private cooperation exists now, continues to improve, and enhances awareness across various sector frontages or geographical frontages. I mean, at the national level, DHS and CISA, as well as federal law enforcement, the FBI, Secret Service, bring in private sector partners for both counsel and advisory capacity, as well as the benefit from information flowing from the federal level. There are biweekly briefings providing updates, very granular intelligence updates on threats, and private sector has the capacity to plug into that, not only to benefit from it, but to inform it. I think that by the very nature of the information sharing and analysis centers in the various critical infrastructure sectors and beyond, as well as at the state level, the presence of international information sharing and analysis organizations, they inherently become public-private partnerships. And increasingly, there are more of them every day showing up. New York City has Cyber Command, a relationship governed by the FBI and NYPD, but they brought the whole of New York City government and private sector in all of its stakeholder interests and optics and equities together around the table. And they have a high fidelity intelligence and information sharing process both ways, two-way street. So there is a lot of hope for Paul Embley's question in terms of what we see.
Yes.
The question is whether all of it is adequate. And I think that takes us back to Dean's observation. It's a problem and a threat that's moving and changing so quickly and with such speed that there's a foot race, in reality for anybody that's trying to defend in that asymmetrical disadvantage.
All right. Thanks for that, Jim. I appreciate that. I don't want to let it go by that Shay raised a good point. He just said, thanks for scaring and caring. But the scaring part is something that I hear from a lot of court colleagues across the country. And Paul again raised, the fact that many courts are in decentralized states. So any responsibility for cybersecurity might be left up to counties, individual counties or localities. And I think all three of you, have sort of a national or a global view of how things might work. But where do you start if you're at that local level? Other than just trying to create a great wall around everything that you're doing and keep yourself cut off from the universe. Where do you begin with this whole issue of cybersecurity if you're at that local level and you may not have a lot of resources available to you?
You've hit on maybe the most painful example of how state and local governments are being disproportionately targeted. There was an incident involving 23 small localities in the state of Texas a while back. I think the only thing they really shared was no security staff, small counties, right? No security staff, probably no full-time IT staff in some cases. And so they relied on their ISP for a lot of their services. So that was a kind of a focal point for the attackers, where they got access to sort of 23 different counties almost simultaneously. And this problem's not going away because the resourcing is not going to change overnight, even if funding comes down. And my understanding is 80% of it from the IIJA is earmarked for locals. And that'll burn a hole in your pocket, but you still can't, it's still not going to be enough money to boil the ocean. So how do you prioritize the projects that you want to move forward with whatever money, you may get from grants or what have you? And again, I'm going to come back to that automation thing. There's no bigger bang for your buck in terms of improving your security outcomes, but it's going to remain. And ultimately, a flavor of automation is to start looking at a managed service, a managed security service, not just a managed ISP or IT provider, but specifically around endpoint protection, a managed detect and response type system. The more I talk to state and local customers about this problem, the more the frustration. I feel like the way forward is to start evaluating what you can automate by handing off the management, the risk transference that Jim was talking about earlier, but not at an insurance level, but kind of at an operational level. And I see that becoming more and more in play for anybody that wants to be successful improving their outcomes.
And a lot of the places that I see have problems are even further cut off from the service providers, the network service provider. So often when we talk about counties or states or municipalities that are actually running the network and the court's kind of a third party on that network, they're not often in the discussion, the governance process. They don't know what services are or are not provided. And so, I think becoming part of the conversation with the service provider is really, really important. Establishing MOUs with the county, city, or municipal provider is a very important step that we've helped several small municipal courts with in terms of getting their foot in the door to understand what the posture really is instead of sort of trusting that it's being taken care of.
Barb, you raise a really good point there. And Jim, I'm going to come to you in a second to follow up on that. But if I could just follow up with Barb for a moment. When you talk about these small jurisdictions, it seems as though oftentimes cybersecurity is an issue that they're balancing with lots of other things that are on their plate at the same time. Whether it's how to get cases from filing to disposition, or arguing over budget, or trying to figure out how do you fill those empty staff positions that everybody's struggling with right now, or we need a new or renovation in a facility, or something along those lines. So have you seen any strategies that are successful to take cybersecurity and sort of raise it up and make it closer to the top of the pecking order in terms of things that need to be done in the courts?
Yeah, actually, we've come into many municipal courts and done an overall high-level risk assessment for those courts, and then sort of elevated that to management view so that it essentially will hit the decision makers a little bit differently. But, it is a struggle because the resources are slim, and often a lot of what they need to do is look for cloud resources, cloud-based resources and things. Some of them have really old legacy case management systems that are completely unprotected. So even though, again, financially, they look at that as a change in asset, they're going to have to, subscribe. The savings that they might realize in avoiding a ransomware attack would be huge comparatively, and the security resources would be so much better, even if they're not perfect. And again, as staffing is a problem almost anywhere in these municipal courts in terms of IT, going to cloud-based resources is often a better answer.
Mm-hmm. All right. Jim, I apologize. I stepped on your mic a minute ago. You were going to add something in as well.
Kevin, the question that seeks to talk about smaller jurisdictions and less resourced courts is a parallel universe for law enforcement. The law enforcement establishment has been in a similar problem or quandary for a long time. I mean, 73% of agencies in the United States have 25 or less sworn officers. They've got no pedigree, or should we expect from an organization that size the ability to do anything other than to lean on the larger jurisdiction or a managed service provider of some sort. So attention after research in 2019 suggested that one of the things we could do immediately to help would be to look at the low-hanging fruit. And so to offer something less than scary here, a lot of points of intrusion tend to result from things that are fairly easy to mitigate. From the standpoint of human behavior, awareness, education, simple patch management. I shouldn't say simple. Patch management for a CIO is never simple. But the truth is there's a lot to be accomplished in that lane. And so from the perspective of what we can do to affect the problem, there is a lot out there that we can do to actually allow the wolf to join a pack. You mentioned earlier in your entree about MSISAC. Literally no reason not to become a benefactor of MSISAC and their sensor base, so that you're getting a managed service from an information sharing and analysis center that is funded by DHS and is out there intentionally trying to help local government, state and local government. And I know, frankly, that MSISAC is always looking to penetrate state and local government further. So there are solutions. There is some good news. We have to avail ourselves of that. And I know that in every jurisdiction, it's not simple. It's baked into the entire complexity of that jurisdiction. So.
All right, good point, Jim. As we go through some of these questions, I am more than happy to keep feeding them to you, but I also want to invite any of our participants. At the bottom of your screen, you've got a reactions button that allows you to raise your hand as we're going along. And if anyone has a question they'd like to ask any of our panelists or direct a comment to them directly, I want to make sure that you feel free to do that. And I'm going to ask Alex and Joe to help moderate that participant list so we can keep an eye out. And if anyone does raise their hands, I just want to be able to make sure that we don't miss that. So with that, I do want to mention to our panelists, John Hoover raises a point about the executive branch and their jurisdiction providing some services, but there are concerns about, in essence, turning power over to the executive branch and giving them the ability to lock out court computers. Have any of you had any experience with that, or do you have any thoughts about whether this is a partnership we should encourage or discourage, or how would you approach it?
So I have encountered it frequently as in both directions. So some courts that have been on an executive branch that now wanted to break away from the executive branch, as well as courts who have taken more advantage of their executive branch qualifications and facilities and things like that. So what's important in that relationship is essentially becoming part of the plan and being able to join the conversation. So to be part of IT and InfoSec governance. So encouraging the executive branch to set up a board where the court is an active participant. Also having some in-depth information about what the security plan is and what the response plan is. In many instances, the court is kept out of those conversations. So it's important, if you are establishing that relationship, to make provision for that up front instead of waiting for things to happen. So being proactive about how you want that relationship to work, establishing an MOU or other types of agreements that set expectations for the level of service and the security of data is very, very important in the very beginning of establishing that relationship, if you decide to do it. But again, there is always the concern of giving over control to the executive branch.
Yeah, I would say this type of jurisdictional question is the way we look at it, I feel, is being impacted by the new world of work, right? Where, I mean, how does central IT shut off my computer if 90% of the people, during COVID at least, COVID opened our eyes to the realities of hybrid work. And so I feel like it's going to shift some of these issues when controlling access to the internet is not the be all end all. But I absolutely agree that if they are using central IT as a service provider, that there has to be partnership there, and there has to be, a shared responsibility. It can't just be about turning off the faucet or what have you. Going forward, it's just all this stuff is changing because more and more stuff sits in the cloud, right? So the central IT really manage it anymore. In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. It's become much more decentralized in terms of people setting up their own networks in Azure, the cloud, whatever, Amazon. So, but yeah, I mean, to me, it's a truism that you need partnership for an effective, IT and risk management relationship.
Kevin, the law enforcement illustration in this case may actually be a bit helpful, simply because I don't know if we have CJIS reps in the audience, but the whole CJIS phenomenon for law enforcement brings a federal and state level mandate for a lot of these smaller jurisdictions, into that discussion. If you want to be attached to this network, you will do the following. So it does actually create kind of an increased prioritization for those issues, and it might be a model that courts could benefit from indirectly. I would argue that the sensitivity of the data at the court level is certainly comparable.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that point, Jim. And it sort of echoes a question that Chris raised. We're just saying everybody wants to solve our productivity issues with technology. And Dean, you mentioned during COVID, we saw lots of ways to do that when we shifted to hybrid hearings or a variety of different things, where we knew we had to change things around to keep business going forward. And yet that's a challenge for a lot of IT professionals who are trying to keep things secure from cyber breaches of one sort or another. So do any of the three of you from your expert seats have a thought on how do you tackle this balancing issue between getting the most out of technology, increasing your productivity as far as you can go, but at the same time staying secure? Because that seems to be a question that everybody is trying to deal with one way or another.
So in March 2020, when basically most public servants in the US went home, a lot of them went home with no hardware, right? Because in state and local, we still have a high percentage of departments and organizations that are still on desktop PCs. So those are not going home with you, most likely. And so I happened in March 2020 to be managing both all the teams, technical specialists, and all the security technical specialists. And let me tell you, both of those people were in massive demand at that time because everybody needed to get teams stood up. They probably already owned it, but they hadn't gotten their deployment. All of a sudden that rocketed forward in terms of priority. And then all the apps that they now had to turn on because everybody went home to get more robust remote access became another huge spike. So my team was working 6-7 days a week because IT was trying to get this stuff done when users weren't on the network. So they were doing it over the weekends and stuff. It was insane. But what it drove home for a lot of customers is your firewall is not your perimeter anymore. Your perimeter is more aptly described as identity, right? Because identity follows you everywhere you go. It's enforceable pretty much anywhere, right? If you set it up, if you architect it correctly, and if you're leveraging the cloud to help do that. And so that's been a major shift, is that we've blown up the traditional perimeter security model where inside is trusted and outside is, fire and brimstone. Because for 2.5 years, everybody lived in the fire and brimstone. So we better learn to accommodate it and change our sort of networking and architecture models to address that. And that happened, it's happened, but it was very painful for state and local customers that we spoke to.
Dean, before I let you go on that point, a couple of comments came up about, whether or how you develop these relationships or moderate these relationships with different groups. Is it through some kind of memorandum of understanding? Is it through a contractual relationship? Is it through the imposition of standards for identity management? Or how do you best do that? Do any of you have any thoughts or expertise in that regard?
And standards, it would be my answer, right? I mean, there's, pick your standard, whether it's CJIS or FedRAMP or what have you. In my opinion, a lot of them are the same 300 controls, rebranded and repackaged. And so it doesn't really matter which one you adhere to, more so important that you pick one and do the work, as they say. to get there. And there's always a huge identity component in that, multi-factor authentication being one of the game-changing things that people really need to get deployed, not just for admins, but for everybody. Anyway, we can talk more about MFA later on, but I would say pick a standard and just start working it.
And in my experience, having a written MOU with the network and service providers is really, really an important part of that relationship. And I also think that you have to be able to talk about these issues as a team or as a group, governance group on a regular basis, or, you really can't understand the security posture, and not knowing is probably the worst thing that you can do. So I do think that if you're using another provider for your service, that conversation needs to take place pretty often.
Kevin, I'm going to argue also, to complement what Dean and Barbara said, that the contract vehicle needs to be nimble. Banking learned this, many years ago, that if you wrote a contract that was less than nimble, then you hear from that vendor, depending on who the vendor was, more intensely as it comes time to renew, as opposed to your day-to-day need. That's not a situation that anybody can afford to be in this discussion, in this context. I mean, so these vehicles and service level agreements have to be very nimble around those controls, because the threat landscape's changing. Your risk is changing. And so a contract has to be able to accommodate that.
So Jim, just to put you on the hook a little bit longer with that, a question popped up is, what's nimble? How do you describe that? Or how do you know if your agreement, whatever that might look like, is nimble or nimble enough?
Well, short of a template we could examine in mass, I think probably everybody's need is unique, just like everybody's risk is unique at some level or degree. And so from the perspective of what I would refer to as the proverbial silver bullet, baking into a contract the ability to adjust off of some equation or business logic that you started with, being able to adjust north or adjust south. If the vehicle doesn't allow for that, then pretty quickly the contract will become inadequate. I mean, the IT threat, the cyber threat environment almost assures us of that.
All right.
And I would say, just review. I've often been to courts who think they have an MOU, and then they can't find it, or no one's read it for a long, long time. So I think by being nimble means have access to it on a regular basis, review it with the service provider on a regular basis. If there are problems, reference it, modify it, and whatever needs to be done to ensure that your security is in place.
Kevin, by the way, Barbara just kind of caused me to think that includes holding the vendor responsible for their own security. I mean, we have seen massive numbers of agencies compromised because of a single vendor, where they had a great business relationship. They were delivering the bottom line operationalized service, from an IT perspective, but their security was lacking. From the standpoint of where this gets really tough, evaluating the vendor and causing the vendor to comply and to be transparent with you as the client, that's got to be part of this.
Yeah. I see that, Joe, you've got your hand up. I'm going to come to you in just a minute, but we do have a question that's popped up a couple of times for our panel about how do you tackle out of jurisdiction cloud hosting? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I didn't.
I think I may be unclear on what out of jurisdiction refers to. Meaning hosted outside of the local area handled by the court?
Not your county or your municipality, or in some places, you're not allowed to host out of state, like outside of Georgia, for example.
Yeah, or even the questioner also noted outside of the country. So that could be as well.
Yeah, I can only speak for Microsoft in that we have a separate discrete government cloud for US government customers actually, we actually have several. We have one for FedRAMP High that's in federal. We have one for DoD. We have a separate sovereign cloud for US, state, and local government. And there, for that cloud, we certify all the computing services are in the US. So we comply with that, whether it's under CGIS. CGIS is especially fun to approach certificate, to get compliant with, because you have to go state by state with all the background checks, and the rules are different. And so we had to go individually through 44 states to get CGIS compliant. It was a major project over a number of years. And yeah, I started, by the way, the Office 365 organization in state and local government. So we were front and center with all the different projects that went along with that. That was a lot of work.
Thank you
But
for that.
that's part of the documentation that we'll do everything in the US, et cetera. And all this stuff is published for transparency purposes on our, what we call our trust center, that's available to any state and local O365 customer or what have you. And it's just all the certification docs and spreadsheets and stuff are all published.
Yeah, and Dean, it looks like you just got a thumbs up in the chat room that they note that they use the MS Azure government CGIS compliant for customers, and it really reduces the attack surface as opposed to local networks. So,
right. And the only one state versus another, one county versus another, we don't have we're not that granular as a hyperscale cloud vendor. We can tell you what data center in what state your main tenant resides in, but the redundancy stuff goes between all our different US data centers. So yeah, we don't have much of an answer at that level of granularity.
Joe Wheeler, I want to come back to you. I appreciate your patience with your hand being up there for a bit, but please chime in with your question or comment.
Well, I'm probably going to cycle us back a touch to the nimble contract concept. You know, I get called on to help folks write these kinds of contract service level agreements for operations and all that. And so what types of things would I expect to do? Do I put in, say, annual reviews with, into that service level agreement? Do I put in checkpoints or something like that? Or is it just basic change management? How can I get ahead of this? Any thoughts, Jim?
Joe, I was going to go back to my disclaimer that every contract's going to look a bit different, but from the standpoint of an organization's individual risk management profile, contract ought to be written kind of as an output or a branch of that risk management program. So when I get into a contractual process, I'm looking at where I am as an organization, my roadmap for my CIO's roadmap, my CISO roadmap, all of those things that are working. They're not complete. They're plugging along. The risk management is adjusting itself as that process plays out. The contract has to be able to accommodate that roadmap. I think the problem for a lot of organizations is they don't have the roadmap to begin with, and a granular enough risk management program. So to the extent that understanding your own risk, the technology you have on board now, what you plan to add within the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months is going to affect a contract. I think that actually unfolds into an answer to your question in more specific terms. But again, everybody's going to be a bit different with regard to what their concerns are, the controls they're after, and how they want to relate with that vendor. From the perspective of what's reasonable to do to a vendor, I mean, obviously that's got a business impact. So there's going to be a need to work through the risk, work through the business reality. I mean, a lot of our risk occurs because of business reality, to be fair, as a driver. And so all that has to be approached. I just find that as we attack this issue at IECP and started really talking about third-party management and vendor management and cloud services and all of those issues, that there was a schism between the process of understanding risk, technology, security, authority to operate, continuous monitoring, and everything that goes with it. And the contract. I mean, the contract was thought about more like the weekly trip to the supermarket, or it was something quite kind of distended. I think they need to be connected, and I think connecting the two programs together will provide the fidelity maybe you're looking for.
Thanks.
All right, thank you for that question, Joe. Dean, I'm going to circle back to you for a minute. It looks like a question popped up that you were able to respond to in the chat room that came from Chad, who's a CIO, about the 365 commercial versus government. You want to elaborate at all on that in terms of your response so that other participants can benefit from that question as well?
Sure. Yeah, I mentioned some of this in the IM, but basically the way we look at it is we're a hyperscale cloud provider. We update our features every quarter, right? And so features will typically land in our commercial cloud first, which has different and I would say lower certification commitments. So they do have FedRAMP and IRS. But they don't have CGIS, for example. That's probably the best example. And so by design, when we update those features every quarter, that triggers a recertification process of the service with a variety. There's probably 14, 15 different standards that we support in our government cloud, but not in our commercial cloud. So any one of those during that period, depending on what the control is of the feature, could trigger a recertification process. And so the delay is almost by design. You're this is going to sound flippant, but you're paying extra for that delay. It's another way to look at it, right? In the sense that we certify to 14 additional standards, and that triggers some process elements that create gaps between when a feature is released in commercial and when it's released in the government cloud. We usually almost always get there, and we try to track that and publish that in a public roadmap tool that we have. But yeah, it's kind of a built-in delay. Does that answer the question?
I think it does, but I'm happy to open the floor to Chad. Chad, if you need any additional clarification or any other points you want to make before we move on.
No, I think that answers most of the question. I think the challenge is just the weighing weighing that delay versus the features that are provided through Microsoft 365. If the security controls are as good as the government cloud, I missed that in my IM, but that's what I'm referring to as the gov cloud. And just weighing, is it worth the delay and the cost if we're still in a very secure environment in commercial?
Yeah, so I don't really focus on overall productivity, feature gaps and stuff like that. I'm focused on security. And a lot of times it's less about a control that's missing that, as pertains to a compliance standard of this or that. It's more often than not like an additive security feature or tool that's not available yet. In other words, it's not required for compliance, but it might be required for threat management or threat detection and response, and that a piece of that is not available because we have been compliant with so many additional standards beyond commercial for so long now that if it's a necessary control, I guarantee you we already have it. And it's more about additive security features I'd say 80% of the time. It's something we'd like to have that would help our outcomes, but is not so much a compliance gap as it is just a feature improvement gap. Sorry if that makes sense.
So just a quick question on that. So that would apply to commercial as well? Or is that you're just saying these additive security features are just going to be for gov?
No. Commercial is always a superset from a feature perspective, but not a compliance perspective, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So So we have a much higher level of commitment. So if there was a gap in one of our controls, we would have hit it on one of those 14 standards already. So we always are compliant. It's just there's stuff that is necessary in the cybersecurity fight that isn't necessarily compliance related. That's the way I think about it.
All right, thank you.
All right. And Jason Cannon, you added another comment in there following up on this conversation about each cloud solution would handle the gaps differently. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, or anything that you think needs to be clarified further here?
No, I think it was pretty clear, but I just wanted to note out that, obviously many of us, many third parties will handle the scheduling and those gaps differently. But I mean, by and large, we handle this, we will handle these constant updates and security things on a regular basis. It's not really limited to Microsoft, but I mean, obviously, IBM Cloud, AWS, I don't want to speak for AWS, but I can say for IBM Cloud, it would be very similar in that we would push those updates on a regular basis. But we all tackle these things. We're all very concerned about security. So just wanted to make note of that.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why, because everybody's got their feet in multiple clouds these days, right? And so that's why you're seeing the rise of, and I always get the acronym wrong, cloud security posture management tools that are able to apply like a compliance standard, a security standard, looking across all the clouds you may have a footprint in. So I don't know about IBM, but definitely Google and AWS, for example, we have a tool that can do that, and other vendors have a tool that can do that because it's a need.
Yeah, IBM has that as well. So
perfect. Thank you for that clarification. Appreciate that. We also have an observation that just got posted from Chris that for small government entities pursuing a few larger vendors that can bundle solutions sought by non-IT and IT staff seems like what is being echoed by the panel as sort of a strategic approach, that this reduces the attack surface of third parties by reducing the number of third parties. It grants different economies of scale, elevates our needs in the eyes of vendors, since we are a bigger account for them, and helps staff to be more productive while mitigating the footprint. Chris, thanks for your comment there. I welcome you. If you want to expand on that anymore, feel free to jump in here. And perhaps, there's Chris.
Sorry, it was more of what I was hearing from Dean and a couple of the others was that balance between everybody wants to solve their problem. And what occurred to me, we use 365 as well currently, enterprise agreement. And what I heard on the conversation, one thing I underlined was your firewall is no longer your perimeter post-COVID. We recently had an event with Cyber Florida here in Florida where that group came in and the FBI talked and mentioned a couple of things that we could be doing. But it all goes back to our biggest struggle is third-party vendors, and you said keeping them accountable to cybersecurity. So the thought entered my head that maybe putting all our eggs in one basket gives us more buying power with that vendor, like a Microsoft. So I don't know if that's what was being said by the panel or not, but that was my comment. Does that make sense?
It certainly does, and I open it up to any of our panelists if they want to comment on that any further.
Yeah, Kevin, I made a comment that maybe part of that, and I don't necessarily have an opinion about how distributed service provider footprint should be for a particular customer. I can talk to it practically. I mean, we did a plenary session on ransomware attacks a couple of years back, and some of the larger victim organizations, agencies were able to continue operating in an austere environment when they lost a high percentage of their infrastructure access to it, because they did have some cloud segmentation. and they had some diversity of service. So there was a practical benefit in that regard, not necessarily designed, just kind of fortuitous. When you talk about, the ability to have greater buying power, I wouldn't argue that point. I think that whenever you can bring a larger customer set to the table, you're probably going to end up with a better expenditure equation, and bang for your dollar. So
I have a pronounced and potentially controversial opinion on parts of what's being touched on here. I think, so let's start with the basics. Our security outcomes suck. I'm talking, the complexity that we have introduced by relying on 20 or 30 different security vendors and tools over the last 20 years, because best of breed started as the only game in town. It's not anymore. If you think of it as a pendulum, the pendulum has swung so far to the best of breed side that nobody can manage anything anymore. And that's actually really important in fighting cybersecurity, is manageability and visibility. And the fact that our tools still can't talk to each other, like from these different vendors, and there's too much data, alert fatigue, etc. Something's got to change. And it's not about getting to one vendor. It's about maybe getting to 3 to 4 to 5 instead of 30. That simplification is an absolute mandate to expect your security outcomes to improve. And the automation stuff that I was alluding to earlier, automating a lot of the stuff your humans do manually today, going through file logs, looking for, comparing this against that to see if there's a threat, etc. That 80% of that has to be automated. And the only way you get there is with better integration and simplification, right? You can't get there managing 30 different vendors. You can pay Deloitte, I'm not picking on Deloitte, $4 million to integrate all that stuff you bought, but that's a skunkworks project, right? So you'll see the industry is moving in this direction. Just look at the acquisition patterns. Everybody is putting together what we would call a security platform, where the stuff comes into your organization pre-integrated, so you don't have to do that, right? So that's what I mean when I say we got to simplify, and so that we can integrate, which gets you to automation, which is really the end game. Sorry, that was a lot.
It's a lot, Dean, but I wonder if you or Barb or Jim would expand on it a little bit more, because you're looking at it from the perspective of the vendor community and what is available and what's out there. I have a different perspective because I come from the courts community, and I'm on the side where a lot of us that are court managers are not IT professionals. We may not even recognize the best of breed. In some respects, we're somewhat, at the, downstream from an information standpoint, and have to rely on what we learn from colleagues, what we can learn from groups like IGIS or other vendor organizations, what kind of expertise we can get from the National Center for State Courts to help us out here. But how do we, as a group, move towards what you're describing, where you take the existing landscape and simplify it and get down to the handful of vendors that would make the security outcomes better than, as you described, sucking.
Yeah, it's my job to be an advocate for not only directly with communities like this, but with the upstream service providers that you use, be that central IT for the state or for, and I know it rolls up differently in different states. That's my job, and my team's job is to advocate for this shift in strategy over the long term. We're not asking you to jettison all your technology debt overnight. We're, not my first day in state and local. You're not startups. So my only answer is I am making the same case to everybody everywhere, including to the people that provide your IT services. So that's the piece that I focus on a daily basis.
Right. Barb, could I pick on you for a minute, and just from the standpoint of the National Center, because you often provide from the court's perspective, sort of the gold standard of, where do we go? How do we improve our systems, and how do we update ourselves and make sure we're in the best position possible? Is what Dean's talking about something that may be coming out with some of the cyber security measures that the National Center's launching and services they're making available to courts, or what other suggestions do you have?
Yeah, and I think just listening to the conversation, one of the most difficult places that courts deal with this is with court case management systems. So, there are some cloud-based court case management systems, but there's some others that are, mostly on premise, and there's huge differences between court case management systems in terms of their ability to provide cybersecurity. So one thing I see courts being particularly vulnerable to is not having vendor assessments of the case management systems. So whether or not you want to put them on AWS or Azure or whatever it might be, in terms of the court case management systems and their security posture, that's difficult to get at and it's also difficult to put into a model where you do have a security platform in place, because a lot of times they're vendor managed. So again, I think the easiest way to look at what Dean and Jim are talking about is through the lens of network and the Office 365 types of platforms and those types of things, but it gets more difficult when you look at court case management, which is usually the most important asset that the court has. That's where their data will reside, and where most of the court activity is recorded. So that's an area that I think we really need to think about.
Yeah, and Barb, as you described that, and focus all of our attention on that critical information link, our case management systems. Jim, I wonder if that has to play in to our thinking, the fact that the law enforcement arena that you've touched on a few times already is one of those areas where we've got connections between our case management systems, and there's a certain amount of information sharing that has to go on between law enforcement and prosecutors and the courts, sharing information back and forth, and that creates additional vulnerabilities. We see the important benefits of information sharing to make our jobs more effective, to provide better service to the public and all of that. But at the same time, as we open ourselves to greater degrees of information sharing, aren't we also opening ourselves to greater degrees of potential vulnerabilities from a cybersecurity standpoint?
Yeah, Kevin, I think that increased connectedness always causes me to wonder from a risk management perspective, what risk did we just add? Whether that's added technology or added users or added organizations and benefactors. And we've been the past decade doing nothing but increasing that fabric, just expanding it in every way we could to get as much out of it as possible to kind of move those core outcomes where we want them to be. I think the game changed on the law enforcement side back in 17, 18, when we saw organizations that were disrupted with cryptographic attacks. And on the far side of that organization was a prosecutor's office. And all of a sudden the prosecutor said, you know what, those 4 or 5 drug cases were really pretty important to us, and I'm not going to prosecute them anymore because you can't prove the integrity of your data any longer. That changed kind of fundamentally a shift in thinking about prioritization of the issue, because the outcome was significant. It was swift, and it was like ice water, to that organization. And I think everybody, kind of stepped back for a second and said, wow, okay, the old evidence locker, if somebody ripped the door off of it, there'd be a deputy or an officer standing at that, that entry point until it was fixed. Whereas we accepted a lot more risk. on a logical footing. So back to the court system. Yeah, we're moving data in ways that a lot of times are, besides at the IT level, not well understood. The actual users, the managers, the executives don't really understand how connected they are. And I do think that it does increase exposure in many cases if it's not done purposefully, deliberately, with a view towards, mitigating that risk and securing those connections. Back to segmentation. I think that, look, my bias is military. So I came from the world of segmentation and segregation as it related to infosec security and information security. I tend to believe that segmentation is good. That does not cause me to discount what Dean said. What Dean said makes a lot of sense. When that gets to a point of unmanageable complexity, well, where are you? I mean, what have you really accomplished? You've broken what you sought to fix, in the fix itself. So just to kind of go back to your original question, I think that the whole information sharing need is growing. It's not diminishing. We want to connect more people. We want to give more people access. We want to provide transparency, access to data. We want to make services user friendly. Everything that we seek to do operationally just takes this issue and compounds it and builds on it. And so security, I'm sorry, I'm going back to Dean's comment again. Security needs to take chaos theory and reduce it to complexity theory that's manageable. Yeah.
So I would say that if you want to keep inside information inside of your organization, we have some pretty awesome tools for that today. So I can not only force you to protect, sort of permission protect and encryption protect a new document as it gets created. I can also crawl your legacy file shares. I'm talking mostly about document stuff here. And I can crawl your legacy file shares, and based on policy rules for data loss prevention or PII, personal information, credit card numbers, et cetera, we can do that within an organization. And it's like identity in the sense that the protection travels with the document. You could drop it on a USB stick in Times Square, and in order to open that document, you would have to be a permissioned user and authenticate, et cetera, to bypass the considerable encryption. We can do that today. That's Microsoft. We've had that internally. We've had it as an offering for a long time. What gets much harder is inter-organizational sharing. Because there aren't great trust models like that, because nobody wants to take everybody that's a partner to them and create identities for them in their identity store. That's the worst case example. And so after that, it becomes a B2B, or in some cases in citizen services, B2C type re-architecting of your identities, your identity infrastructure, if that makes sense. And that can be painful. But if you get it in place and you're able to do a B2B relationship, you can have that same functionality across different organizations. So there are tools, but there's some pain around rethinking how you do identity today with your partners.
All right, great comments. And I want to take us in a little different direction based on some questions that we had gotten prior to the program. But before I do that, I just want to make a note for everybody that is participating that we're about 15 minutes away from the top of the hour. So if you haven't gotten your comment or question in the chat box yet and you're thinking about it, this would be a great time to add it in and make sure we get to it before we run out of time. But Jim and Barb and Dean, a lot of what we've been talking about purposely has been thinking about this from the end user's perspective or the court's perspective on how we do a better job with our cybersecurity. Since we've got so many IGIS members and vendor representatives that are on the call today, one of the things I wondered if either they would address or you would address is what can or should courts expect from the vendor community? If we're in a relationship with you because we're using some of your software or systems of one sort or another, and let's say as a court administrator, I always worry about my court getting hacked. But suppose you're the vendor and you get hacked. What responsibility do you have to us as a customer, to the courts as a customer, to advise us of what's going on, to tell us what needs to be done to protect ourselves, if there's anything that can be done? How should that relationship work coming from the vendor side of the street? And I'll just throw that open to any of you who might want to respond.
So, Kevin, I'm just going to say very quickly, if you accept the fact that the ESS sector is a critical infrastructure sector and that the vendor is part of that critical infrastructure sector, they now have a legal mandate to report, given the new legislation that's on has been signed and made its way out of Capitol Hill. So, from the perspective of critical infrastructure reporting moving forward in the IT security space, we now have sanctions if you don't report that are present themselves to the government. So I think that's one change that makes kind of the discussion around your question a little bit different than it was a year and a half ago. The other thing is there's another bill that last I looked at it, forgive me, I'm not up to date on this right now. It had passed the House and the Senate and was waiting for presidential signature. And it was essentially the Better Cybercrime Metrics Act. I mean, we're headed in a direction where we might actually have some really good codified national level data with regard to this problem. And I think those together in tandem tend to help move what the commercial world needs to do to adjust to that reality, kind of moving forward. At the end of the day, I still don't think that diminishes the level of competency that each organization has to have in working with a vendor, contracting with a vendor, making sure that that vendor and that relationship contractually from a business perspective is set up to accommodate the risk reality of the organization.
Thanks for that perspective, Jim. Dean, please go ahead.
Yeah, so the reality of the commitment, whether it's contractual or not, is that when you're a hyperscale cloud vendor, there's only a couple, maybe 3 or 4. Your business model is based on trust, right? Come host your stuff with me. It will be as useful or better, and in some cases, maybe more secure. And so we take security very seriously because our trust model evaporates overnight if we have a catastrophic breach. And by the way, breach can be kind of tricky when you're hosting other people's stuff because there's Microsoft's own internal infrastructure and operations, but there's also it's a gigantic sandbox for other people to do stuff, right? That's the whole idea. People are hosting their VMs in there. They can do ethical and non-ethical things from those VMs, right? And you will see hackers doing stuff from AWS cloud or our cloud, and we have significant ability to tamp that down or take that down. But there's a bit of an investigation process to doing that, since people are paying to put their stuff in our cloud. We don't just want to shut them down without some kind of evaluation. So there's that kind of breach as well, where it's not where it's working as designed, but people are doing nefarious things with it, right? So there's that version of a breach versus our internal sort of Azure fabric, the underlying fabric of Azure being itself compromised. And obviously we take that very seriously. It's why we employ 8,500 people in cyber, because it's that important to our business model that not happen. So that's a half an answer, but.
We'll take it. And any answer is better than none at this point. So, all right. Those are great comments, but I also want to take the opportunity to try to press this a little bit farther down the line. So we've talked at some length about different things that can be done to harden defenses, to work on cybersecurity, to recognize it when it happens. But one of the things that I think drives fear into the hearts of many court managers is what do we do knowing that we've got essential services that have to be provided to the public? Many of our vendors that are participating today help provide that IT support to make sure we're able to provide those services, especially emergency services that courts have to provide on a daily basis. But if we get attacked to the point where we have to make the decision to cut a connection to the internet, basically shut everything down, because that's part of the process, the remediation or recovery process that Barb talked about in her intro. How do we shift nimbly enough so that we can continue to provide services when we are cut off? What does that look like? How can experts, vendors, service providers, consultants help an individual court when they've got to shut down? And now judges seem to think that we can flip a switch and that everything is going to come back on in 10 or 15 minutes, as opposed to perhaps weeks of an investigation, trying to figure out what happened, where the breach came from, how we're going to remediate those things and come back up safely again. So what ideas or suggestions or advice do you have, or do any of our vendors that are on the call today have, about what does a court do when that happens and we have to cut the umbilical cord? And yet we still want to be able to function and provide some basic level of service.
Well, courts, for the most part, don't have a plan for those incidents. As I've been in several courts where that has occurred, and basically every workstation was pulled off the floor and forensics were applied, and people had to go out and buy new workstations really, really quickly. And so the approach there becomes kind of a panic approach, and things happen that go wrong. For example, some of the hard disks were stolen because they weren't physically secured, and some of them were very important because they had code on them from developers and things like that that was important, and hadn't been properly stored, in a proper software tool. So part of it is having a plan and planning in advance for what might happen. And for the most part, the courts that I've gone in don't have such a plan overall for what might happen from if there's a physical event, or if there is a cyber event in terms of, we can't get to our network anymore. So I think the first step is putting a plan together. And I don't know that there's any template for that plan, but the first step again is that governance process whereby you understand what your software and hardware assets are, and you understand what's important to protect and what has to be running when you get back up and running. So the courts that I've been in haven't had that plan, and it becomes kind of, you're just doing things right and left, and it's not orchestrated. So that's the first step.
I have some good news and some bad news. The bad news is I'm going to go out on a limb here and say increasingly, as your key core systems and infrastructure reside in the cloud, voluntarily turning off your internet access is not going to be an option or supportable. I think, if you lose it because a truck goes into a bridge and knocks over some electronics, that's different. But cutting it off voluntarily, I don't think is going to be a strategy going forward. So, and this is where what's going to take a while, but is a necessary shift in how we deal with security, is something that every vendor, scopes differently, but it's generally zero trust. In other words, I will live on a network that is designed to assume I have already been breached. And the trick is not to stop the breach, it's to stop the damage. So there can be an attacker on my network, but they just can't do anything, which is panacea today. But the reality, that's the promise of zero trust, is I will never have to turn off my internet connection, because I don't care if there's an attacker. Not that I don't care, but I know that I've locked things down and architected things such that even if they get in, they can't move around. They can't access anything, right? It's a radical rethinking of our security approach, and it will take a while to get there. But as more of your stuff moves to the cloud, and you're going to have to find different ways to defend, like identity, right, and device health, and zero trust encompasses all of that. But that's where we have to get, and then this question becomes moot. Bit optimistic, but it's where we need to direct people, in my opinion.
Agreed. Jim, please go ahead.
Kevin, I'm just going to take one stab at a small piece of what Dean just said, and that would be in the context of risk management that is driven by real security test and evaluation, identifying core business outcomes that you can't stand to live without. I mean, I have to be able to restore. Thank you, Microsoft. Whenever I had a hardware failure, there was some restore point that I could count on getting back to some equation in my data set. Now, from the standpoint of whether we're thinking far enough into the future in terms of immutable data, creating immutable data stores that are not prone to the whole set of malware that we fear today. I mean, the ability for, as Dean said, somebody gets inside, but they can't change the data set. It's written once. I can read it forever, but they can't change it. They can't alter it. They can't destroy it. I mean, not unless they physically destroy the infrastructure that it's on, that it's stored on. I mean, when we get to that level of zero trust, then now the only enemy in this discussion is how long does it take me to restore, and how much time do I lose in the process of restoring? I mean, I ran into a young guy who worked at Office Depot years ago, and he's telling me about a server he ran in his home. And I said, doesn't that expose your family? And, because he had it kind of sitting right there, kind of on the public cloud, as he got his point of presence. He said, I don't care. If anything happens to the box, I got a copy of it sitting in the other room. I just rebuild the box and go back to work. Well, I mean, we've got to get to that point. I think that's what Dean's saying is, we've got to get to a point where the threat doesn't matter. But a small piece of that would be look at recovery right now and take recovery as far as we can in that direction at this moment in time, because that's actually possible. We can do that.
Yeah, and I think we've got a comment from Shay echoing many of your comments as well, giving some other examples, of separate networks and, communications that have been employed to help out here. And he seems, Barbara, to think you are right on target with the planning ahead, and suggest tabletop exercises that might help people as we go forward. And we're getting close on time here. We do have one last question. Does anyone have a model to use when prioritizing new purchases of applications as a means of helping educate on security risks? Anyone have a quick response before we run out of time on that?
It comes back to standards for me, is it, are there sort of relevant standards, security standards that the application complies with, that are relevant to you? I mean, that's what comes to mind first is just, as part of a procurement process, you bake in some compliance requirements for the applications you're evaluating.
All right, Dean, thank you for that. Let me just take a moment, because we've hit the top of the hour. I want to thank Jim Emerson and Barbara Holmes and Dean Accavelli for a great conversation today, and for handling a lot of questions that have been thrown in your direction. We hope all of you participating found the first part of this virtual summit series helpful. I want to remind everyone that we've got a break now until 3 p.m. Eastern time or noon Pacific time, when we'll have the second 90-minute segment that'll be coming up. That will be hosted or moderated by Joe Wheeler. And the afternoon session is intended to provide everyone with an opportunity to hear what IGES members are doing to help mitigate the risk for our communities when combating cyber-related challenges. So we hope you can join us for that. And again, I want to make sure everyone is also aware of opportunities that are available either through the IGES Courts Advisory Committee or the IGES Cybersecurity Task Force that is being started up. If you want to participate in either of those events, you can check in with Alex and he can let you know how to make those connections. And then just a reminder that IGES also has a mid-year briefing coming up soon that's scheduled from August 31st to September 1st. So there's information available on the IGES website if you want to look for more information there. And, you know, thanks to everyone again for taking the time here. And I think are a minute over, but we're going to wrap up at this point. And I hope to see everyone back online at 3 p.m. So thank you and enjoy your break now.